I've covered movie tie-in games many times on this page, but Batman Returns is a special sort of affair, one that deserves a video all on its own. It might not exactly be a surprise that Batman Returns had a good few licensed games released for it. It's the sequel to a huge movie that shifted truckloads of merchandise, and the original 1989 Batman itself had 6 separate games across various platforms that were directly related to the movie, which is itself a pretty big number. But Batman Returns obliterates that. Counting them all up, from the 16-bits to Tiger Electronics, I believe that there are 10 separate Batman Returns based games. You've got a bunch of side-scrollers, some of which are pretty close to each other, a couple of beat-em-ups, a driving game, even a point-and-click adventure. That's a lot. I'm not sure if Batman Returns is the film with the most tie-in games associated with it, but it's surely got to be up there. So, well, let's look at the lot. It's a good range. You've got well-known classics, underrated gems, the odd bit of controversy, and naturally some titles that would have been best left in the old Bat bin. And this isn't just going to be a plain old summary. We're going deep into the catacombs with these games, with plenty of development tales to be told along the way. Let's begin with the obvious top title, the one that most everyone probably knows immediately. Konami's SNES Batman Returns game was released quite a while after the film, even after its home video release. It came out between February and May of 1993, depending on where you were. Konami already had something of a pedigree when it came to licensed beat-em-ups, primarily in the arcade. And indeed, in the last video, it was mentioned that they could have potentially made an arcade Batman beat-em-up if Atari hadn't beaten them to the rights for a Bat-based arcade game. As it is, particularly seeing as Batman Returns actually doesn't have an arcade game, we have to be content with this SNES effort. And I say content, but this is one of the SNES's best beat-em-ups. The game takes you through 7 scenes from the movie. Most of the time you'll be duking it out against the many varied goons of the Red Triangle Gang, and you'll be doing so in various different manners, from more traditional left-to-right beat-em-up stages, to single plane stages where you're limited to the Batarang, and even a single scene where you take control of the Batmobile. There's plenty of boss fights, from the Triangle's top strongmen and organ grinders to a couple of showdowns with Catwoman, the Penguin's duck vehicle, and finally old Oswald himself, right in the middle of his lair in Arctic World. The game itself was created by a largely very different team from those who worked on Konami's arcade beat-em-ups, although you can find plenty of good games on their CVs. Director Yoshio Yoshimoto previously was a planner on the Famicom's excellent Kid Dracula, and there's all sorts of other titles dotted around, including more beat-em-up based affairs like Monster in My Pocket and the SNES version of Turtles in Time. There is a pretty big effort to make the play in Batman Returns different from what you would normally see in an arcade game like, say, The Simpsons or Bucky O'Hare. The different segments in stages have already been mentioned, but even if there's usually only the most rudimentary bits of platforming, being limited to the Batarang does change things up, and it also helps to make this game a fair bit longer than your typical arcade brawler. The Caped Crusader also has considerably more moves than Konami's norm. Naturally, he can punch, kick and grab enemies, throwing them about or even grabbing 2 enemies at once for a very satisfying noggin knocker, but he's got several special abilities. A twirl of the cape clears crowds at the cost of some life, while Bats also has a choice of using either the Batarang, which stuns enemies from afar in normal stages, or a grappling hook that produces another special attack. Again, there's a little bit of life toll to pay for that. He can also block attacks and use the explosive test tube as a special weapon, although this comes in quite limited quantities. There's plenty of enemies on screen, and even if they aren't exactly imaginatively named, there's a whole load of thin clowns, fat clowns, tall clowns, knife throwers and so on. It feels very good to give them the old knuckle sandwich, especially when you can also chuck them directly into the ground or even into the background. Other little things like the Batmobile stage help change things up a bit too. Certainly makes sure that the game doesn't outstay its welcome. Another thing that helps is that the game's bloody lovely looking. I do reckon this might be a case where the SNES's muted colours really help capture Batman Returns' thoroughly wintry aesthetic, making for a purposefully dim, gothic and gloomy setting. It sounds fabulous as well. The soundtrack isn't necessarily the most memorable thing ever in terms of melodies and what have you, but it's full of action-packed riffs on the classic Danny Elfman score, and again, it absolutely fits what's going on in the game. There's even a little bit of impetus to carry on playing once you've finished a normal one, getting a message to try the harder difficulties if you really want to be considered a true Dark Knight. If there's only one complaint that people usually had about this game, well, it's the old one from SNES's Final Fight. It's single player only, with no chance for someone to play as Robin. Mind you, that would be quite silly, seeing as he's not even in the movie. Maybe they could have had a second player play as Alfred Pennyworth in a mechanised suit or something. In any case, the structure of Batman Returns does perhaps make multiplayer somewhat unfeasible, and regardless of that, it's still one of the best 16-bit beat-em-ups around. A tremendous title that, for what it is very hard to fault. If you were a Mega Drive owner back in the day, then honestly, this is one of those games that would have you a bit envious of your SNES sporting mates, especially when you compared it to the Batman Returns game that the MD got. The Mega Drive Batman Returns, unlike its SNES counterpart, is a thoroughly Western game, developed by Malibu Interactive, which is a bit weird. Malibu Interactive was formed after Acme Interactive, a short-lived studio that Bob Jacobs set up after the demise of Cinemaware, merged with the Malibu Graphics Publishing Group, a comic book publisher. You perhaps wouldn't expect the name of Malibu to be associated with Batman, but well, here we are. Malibu Interactive didn't make all that many games, most of them aren't particularly good, and this one, yeah, it's no exception to that, being a pretty generic side-scroller with several glaring and hideously annoying flaws that I'm all too eager to point out. An odd little thing here is that unlike most of the other games, the Mega Drive Batman Returns starts in the middle of the film. The intro scene sees Penguin murdering the Ice Princess and framing Batman for her death, before the rest of the game's 5 acts consist of locations such as the Cathedral, Max Schreck's store, the Red Triangle Circus, and naturally Penguin's hideout. So where do I start with this one? The Dark Knight is blessed with a few more tools in this title. Obviously he's got punches and kicks, and he can also glide and use his grappling hook, but his belt also contains a regular Batarang, smoke bombs, a bat swarm, the bat claw, and homing Batarangs, all of which are naturally in limited supply. This approach is a little similar to what the Bat had in the old Sunsoft NES game, and the weapons do occasionally have some use beyond the cheesing of bosses. Smoke bombs can be quite handy when it comes to stunning enemies, and the Batarang can actually deflect enemy bullets. With that said, the most powerful items are indeed probably best reserved for boss fights, where you're really going to need them, especially when you consider how detestably cheap this game is, which we'll get to in a minute. The problems with this one come thick and fast. Batman is, well, he's quite slow and ponderous. He does not exactly come across like the master of 1,001 different martial arts he's supposed to be. He's more like a slop who can do little except kick at short range and fire a grappling hook out of his crotch that occasionally decides to latch onto the ledge you're aiming at. Less Michael Keaton, more Victor Lewis Smith. And while Batman himself may be a slug, the Red Triangle goons certainly aren't. They're fast, come at you from all angles, and flip about all over the place, usually hitting you at least once. Even the weapons are somewhat hamstrung in this regard. You can only use them when you're on the ground and not when jumping, which is actually a total nuisance. As a result, this is the sort of typically crappy Western game where you end up always slowly inching forward in order to be as on guard as possible for an enemy spawning and coming at you like greased lightning. Oh, and by the way, this is one of those games that gives you an alert sound whenever you get low on energy. That's always such a great inclusion, and is never not incredibly friggin' annoying. The irritating enemies certainly contribute to the game's cheapness, but it's pretty well baked into most parts of the game. Some of the boss fights are especially annoying. The strongman in Act 2 who chucks debris from the entrance of Shrek's shop is awful, seeing as you only get a small window in order to outmaneuver him, get on his level, and then cheese him with your big guns. One of the very worst bits is the rolling ball at the end of the same act. You have to be damn near perfect with your movement to avoid getting crushed by it, particularly with how slow Bats is, and it's virtually guaranteed to kill you at least once. It's the sort of cheap bastardry where the devs almost know how awful they're being, so they give you a single extra life near the start of the descent, and you've still got to fight and defeat the penguin at the end in order to avoid doing it all over again. Constant stuff like this and the endless cheap hits from enemies makes the whole thing completely unfun. A hard game, but not hard in any way that's entertaining, just through being bitty at every single turn and compounding that with a playable character who just feels slow, stiff and ill-equipped. You do get unlimited continues, and you can even stick as many as 7 lives on the Caped Crusader. However, using a continue will start you at the very beginning of an act, and seeing as each act contains around 3 or 4 levels apiece, yeah, that's a pretty big step back, the sort that may well just make folks turn the bloody thing off if they get to the end of an act just to fall short at the finish. And I'm certainly not done with the complaints. Everything else about this game is thoroughly drab. Not in the way that the SNES game manages to capture the grim nature of the movie, just drab in the sense that levels are graphically uninspired and often appear to be thrown together. It commits another classic sin where you don't know what you can actually jump on and what's just background. It features most of the same enemies and boss characters from the movie that you would find in the SNES game, but nothing about them really stands out at all. And then you've got the music. Batman Returns uses the somewhat infamous GEMS sound driver, which is usually blamed for a whole load of lousy tunes on the platform. It can produce good work in the right hands, such as Howard Drossin or Mark Miller, but this? Nah, especially not if you do something foolish like comparing it to the first MD Batman game soundtrack. Not all the music is bad, although the first level tune is a particular stinker, and that tends to be what people remember. It doesn't help that the music always seems to fluctuate in tempo either, and the sound effects are pretty grating throughout even if you don't include the frickin' low energy alarm. On the whole, yeah, I'm afraid this is a bit of a stinker. There's the odd moment where you think that there might have been a better game here, but it does end up being one of those classically disappointing Western Mega Drive platformers. Certainly not one of the worst games on the system, but something that I would put in the same class as, say, Chakan the Forever Man or the original X-Men. Anything that's good here just gets swamped in thoroughly boring mediocrity and being cheap as all hell. Not in any way recommended. However, there is an argument to be made that the Mega Drive game isn't the main version of Batman Returns that Malibu Interactive were concentrating on. There is another one that's got a fair bit more worth to it. I am, of course, talking about the Mega CD version. This one came out a couple of months after the Mega Drive cartridge and does feature some very important additions that make it one of the absolute best of the upgraded Mega CD titles. Essentially what we have here is 2 games in one, the platforming game and the driving game, and you can either play these separately or interwoven, changing from driving to platforming. The platforming bit? Well, that's largely the same as what you would find on the Mega Drive without too many improvements, although the CD audio soundtrack and effects are a considerable step up, and it doesn't have a low energy alarm. It does have all the annoying cheap crap that you would find on cartridge, but you are certainly better off playing the platformer on Mega CD, simply thanks to the improved music alone. However, really, you should just forget about the platformer completely. The driving game, that's where it's at. Good grief, this is a better experience in every possible way. You cruise along in the Batmobile, or the Batski boat on the last 2 levels, and once again there's 5 acts that will feature multiple stages, and you need to clear a certain number of goons in bikes, cars, trucks and various other vehicles in each stage before the timer runs out. This is where the real benefits of the Mega CD hardware are shown. Forget about FMV, this is all about the improved hardware scaling, meaning that the game moves along at a ridiculous pace without ever compromising on the backgrounds, the level of sprites, or the amount of action that you get, and there's a killer soundtrack to boot. This is a really great technical showcase for the Mega CD, right alongside the excellent games that Core Design made for the hardware. It's pushing the add-on to its limits, and it might well be the most impressive example of hardware scaling that had been seen on a console up to this point. You've got undulating roads, big jumps, the lot, and all through this it never slows down. On top of that, well, more than just a technical showcase, it's just quite a fun game. It's very enjoyable and arcadey, allowing you to go full whack on the turbo and blast those red triangle bastards to Kingdom Come with your guns and missiles. Certainly a toughie in parts, with a timer that's always going to keep you on edge and some right tricky boss fights, but even if they're different genres, the difficulty here is everything that the original Mega Drive isn't, seeing as it's certainly hard, but always engaging. This is absolutely the sort of game that there really should have been more of on the Mega CD, as opposed to the FMV titles and what have you. Perhaps there would have been if the add-on had been more successful and there'd been more budget and resources devoted to it, but games like Batman Returns really do show off its true capabilities. Very good indeed, and definitely one of the best Batman Returns games. Perhaps not quite as good as the SNES beat 'em up, but not all that far off. You really should give this a go if you haven't. Let's move on then. We've had 16-bit Batman Returns, so now we should look at the 8-bit games. Once again, we've got a NES game that's a beat 'em up, and a Master System game that's a platformer. The 8-bit Batman Returns games aren't particularly well known at all. As you might expect, the NES game is a very late title indeed for the system, coming out between late 92 and 93 with no Japanese release, while the Master System title is a European exclusive, although there is a very similar game available in the USA for the Game Gear that we'll cover a bit later. Could we potentially be on the cusp of finding that oh-so-treasured thing in retro YouTube parlance? The fabled hidden gem? Well, let's have a look, kicking off with the NES title. The NES game is, much like the SNES one, a game by Konami, although it does play a fair bit differently. You don't get the Batarang only stages this time around, although you still get the Batmobile, albeit this time from a side-on perspective, and there's also room for a Batski boat stage. Batman can still use both Batarangs and a grappling hook and switch between them with the select button, but his other moves depend on what direction you're holding. He can block attacks using down and B, and he can perform a slide using down and A. If you aren't doing that, it's attack and jump, and the cape twirl is retained if you press both buttons together. Is this good? It can be a bit annoying in parts, especially if there's a bit where you've got to do some platforming. It can be a little too easy to throw a slide as opposed to jumping. Still, the controls are okay on the whole. The enemies are largely the same as they are in the SNES game, just scaled down a little. The slide can be pretty effective when it comes to closing the distance and getting a good drop on them, but I would say that on the whole this plays a bit tougher than the 16-bit. A big part of that is only getting 1 life per continue. You can gain extra health via pickups and also a bat box that essentially acts as an extra life if you get enough points, but continuing does take you back to the very start of the stage as opposed to the start of the level you're on. However, there is a password system in the NES title. On the whole, the game does feel, well, very Konami. The graphics are as typically good as you would expect from them, especially for such a late NES game, and the music is of their usual high standard. There are definitely some annoyances though. The enemies can be a little bit cheap, and this is one of those beat-em-ups where environmental challenges affect you, but don't affect the enemy. For instance, they can happily walk on electrified floors without getting hurt, or they can walk along the rooftops without gradually slipping off of them. This sort of thing isn't at all a deal breaker, but it does irk me a little bit. Where does this stand compared to other big NES beat-em-ups? It's certainly a curious one. Being that it came out so late, it's not one that a lot of people know. However, I would struggle to put it right up there with the very best. It kind of wears out its welcome a fair bit in a way that the SNES game certainly does not. I certainly think that Konami created better beat-em-ups with their second and third Turtles game on NES. It's hardly a bad game though, certainly a serviceable bit of brawling, and it still manages to capture the feel of the movie and the main scenes from it. The guys working on the game certainly weren't slouchers either. Following on from this title, designer Toshiki Yamamura and lead artist Tisaku Seki's next work would see them take the lead on no less a game than Castlevania Bloodlines. This wasn't Konami's final game on the NES, that wouldn't actually come until 1994 when they released an 8-bit version of TMNT Tournament Fighters, but Batman Returns does show that even at such a late stage, the company is still putting a good showing on the legendary 8-bit platform, even if it perhaps isn't amongst their very best NES works. Seeing as how the Master System Batman Returns is a European exclusive, I bet you're thinking that this is going to be a cut-down version of the 16-bit title that's probably also by Malibu. I mean, that was often the case after all. And while I wouldn't blame you for thinking that, you would be completely wrong. This is a totally different platformer, and it's not even by a Western developer. No, this is by Aspect, a Japanese studio with a strong Master System pedigree. This game has been planned by no less a figure than Katsuhiro Hasegawa, otherwise known as the Hase, a man responsible for plenty of great 8-bit games. He's on the likes of Deep Duck Trouble, the Game Gear and Master System Shinobi titles, Master System Ghouls and Ghosts, Axe Battler, and Legend of Illusion. Hiroshi Eso, who oversaw the Game Gear version, his credits include Rystar, Dragon Force, Knuckles Chaotix, and Tempo. The sound in this game? Motohiro Kawashima and Yuzo Koshiro. This is a pretty damn credible staff if ever there was one, all of whom are part of absolutely loads of great games. So how on earth has a game with such a collection of ruthless operators behind it fallen under the radar? Looking at it? Yeah, I really don't know why. If you like action platformers, particularly of the 8-bit variety, you should probably play this freaking game, right now. Because what we have here is an excellent example of one. If you want a game that's basically Batman meets Shinobi with a big slice of Bionic Commando for good measure, this might just be the game for you. You play as Brucey Baby through 5 levels. Each level has 3 parts, although there are actually 2 separate routes to the big final stage, which is Penguin's Lair, and you can switch routes between each level. Route 1 is probably best for your first time out, as the levels are considerably easier. Route 2 is definitely going to give even seasoned platform players a tough time in parts, and the last level is certainly not a picnic. The approach here is a little bit like that in the Game Gear Shinobi games, I think, at least when it comes to being able to pick your poison, although there are no big upgrades. Batman's toolkit is kind of simplified compared to other games. You just get a Batarang, which functions exactly like a boomerang and comes back to you. You can jump and glide, and you can use the hook. And you best get used to that grappling hook, because using it is going to get very intricate, pretty sharpish. The Caped Crusader can upgrade his movement speed, as well as the speed and power of his Batarang. However, he dies in one hit, and loses his Batarang upgrades on death. Generally speaking, death isn't a big punishment. You start back right from where you fell, and there's a lot of power-ups and even extra lives dotted around in containers, meaning it's easy to build up a surplus. The hefty use of the grappling hook is definitely where a bit of Bionic Commando comes into play, particularly the NES version, since you have to do a few really complex sequences with the hook in something of a similar vein to what you'd find in that game, especially in the Route 2 versions of some of the stages. Much like that game, it's very satisfying when you're actually able to nail a sequence without losing any lives, although it's most certainly going to take a bit of practice to do such a thing. I guess the reason why this game has gone so unheralded over the years is because people have just assumed that it's going to be similar to the 16-bit Mega Drive game. That was the case with a lot of European-only Master System titles, and while that wouldn't have necessarily been a bad thing, yeah, this ends up being a totally different beast, one where the Dark Knight really gets to strut his stuff. The graphics are perfectly fine for a Master System title, the music is as excellent as you would expect from a duo like Kawashima and Koshiro, and overall, it's a really fun 8-bit platformer. I would say in particular that if you really like the two Game Gear Shinobi games and you wish that there was a third game just like that, then this will very likely satisfy you. So is this a hidden gem? Oh, absolutely! Sound that hidden gem klaxon. Let Metal Jesus Rocks and company praise this one to the high heavens. This is one of the very best Batman Returns games. Hell, I would go as far as to say that it is second only to the SNES version, and it's really close between them. Discovering a game this good is one of the joys about making a video like this one, and you should absolutely give this one a go, immediately. Seeing as we do have a couple of handheld games to look at, it makes sense to do the Game Gear title next. It is very similar to the Master System game and actually came out first, although there are differences. One difference of course is that the Game Gear Batman Returns only came out in North America, while the Master System version only came out in Europe. But there are other differences when it comes to the actual games. The levels are changed here to be a bit more like a side-scrolling beat-em-up, with much less in the way of platforming. I think that, on the whole, this makes the game a bit easier than the Master System title, although it's a shame that there's less emphasis on swinging around with the grappling hook. The game's system also changes a fair bit. Batman now has an energy bar as opposed to dying in one hit, although losing that bar now starts you back at the beginning of a stage. There's no upgrades this time. Batman can now change the range and strength of his Batarang through the pause menu, although I personally just tend to stick with the short range and high power option. You also get a special which allows the Batmobile to come in and fire some missiles at your enemies, Streets of Rage style, and there is the addition of a couple of cutscenes. The graphics and the music are largely the same and still very good, with Batman himself being a bit bigger here on the GG and there being a few more special effects in some bits. But while this game is still very decent indeed, my preference would definitely be the Master System version, due to that one having a lot more platforming. But again, this is still a really good game that's worthy of the Caped Crusader's name. An excellent 8-bit effort all around on the Sega platforms. Sticking with handhelds, we come to one of the Batman Returns titles that was undoubtedly marketed and pushed the most. Indeed, it's the one that came out first. Batman Returns on the Atari Lynx beat every other game of the movie to the market, coming out as early as June 1992, just in time for the film's premiere, and Atari was certainly eager to push it with TV advertising and so on, even including it as a pack-in title for the second version of the Lynx in some regions. Headed up by the late John Squatch, an Atari veteran who worked on various Lynx and Jaguar titles including Checkered Flag, Rampart and Cybermorph, the programming was done by the duo of Centipede Millipede God-tier player Eric Ginner and Jerome Strach, who'd eventually go on to work for Pixar. An early interview with Squatch for Atari's official Explorer Online magazine in 1992 reveals that the Lynx version of Rygar was the team's main inspiration for gameplay, and even comments somewhat on the rather short time that they had to make the game. Production didn't even really start in earnest until November of 1991, and the pretty hefty crunch that was involved in getting this game ready on time for the movie's cinematic release on June 19th. And so, well, what's the end result of all of this? Yeah, I really don't like this game. I do have a couple of positive notes. There are nice big graphics and nice big sprites. It's a bit more cartoony than the other Batman Returns titles we've seen, but I don't necessarily mind that. Everything else about this though is infuriating. The music is quite grating and there isn't exactly a lot of it, meaning that it gets on your nerves very quickly. The game itself is a typical side-scroller with 4 pretty large levels. That doesn't seem like much, but oh boy, this game is brutal. It swamps you with enemies right from the get-go, usually ones that will throw explosives right in your face and knock poor bats around like a pinball. The first level alone, which I admittedly cannot get past, is an absolute murderer's row of dynamite and bomb-chucking clowns, knife throwers, organ grinders, and even a part where you'll instantly die if you don't happen to be behind the mailbox when Max Shrek's store blows up. Oh, and you fight the duck vehicle at the end. He moves like Carl Lewis, and you only hurt him if you can hit his tiny little eye. Good luck. And did I mention that you only get 1 life, 1 energy bar, and that's your lot? You can get refills, but there are no continues, my friend. This game may look like it's short if you just look at a long play on YouTube, but, well, good luck, sucker. Even limited supplies of Batarans and test tubes aren't going to help you all that much. I bravely save-scummed this first level on an emulator as much as I could, but alas, it didn't really help me out much. It is savage, and certainly not in a way that's fun. It assaults you to the point where really, you're best off just running through stages as fast as you can, trying to avoid contact with the enemy, because facing up to them is usually going to result in at least a couple of hits on you, if not worse, and you can ill afford that. Running away is not exactly what I want from a game based around Batman, I have to say. So yeah, this really isn't a good one. Reviews of the title from the time period said much the same thing. It's not a bad looker, but the difficulty is completely out of whack. Perhaps if it had a bit more time, they could have made a fuller game here. I can almost see why the game only gives you 1 life, seeing as it is only around 15 to 20 minutes long on a full playthrough. But I guess they didn't have a great deal of time to do any more if they only had a few months to make the game, and a significant chunk of that time would have been spent getting approval from Warner and so on for what they were making. In the end, it turns out that making sure a game comes out for the film's premiere maybe isn't always the best approach. Still, the Lynx is hardly the worst Batman Returns handheld experience. There is, after all, a Tiger Electronics game to consider. Oh yes, there most assuredly is. Unfortunately, while you can play a bunch of Tiger handhelds in MAME, this one has yet to be dumped or made playable, but there are adverts that proclaim the title to be Tiger's hottest handheld to date and are classically cheesy, with some annoying kid pretending to enjoy themselves and be utterly wowed by what they're seeing. From what's there, it appears to be some game where you ride around in the Batmobile, and considering the general standard of Tiger's titles, I can pretty safely say that this LCD game is worse than the Lynx one. That's kind of a no-brainer. Still, it is another version of Batman Returns, and so I thought I should mention it.
Face the Penguin in 5 levels of skill.
You don't really think you'll win, do you?
The Batman Returns handheld electronic game, now playing in a pocket near you.
One curious thing, mind you. We've got Batman Returns on most every other platform, with the exception of the arcade, but there is another major one that's missing. There's no Game Boy Batman Returns title, which is a bit surprising considering how popular said handheld was. There doesn't appear to have been any plans for a Batman Returns game, although one presumes that the idea must have been floated. Without any concrete information, we can hazard a guess at why there wasn't one through referring to the big timeline of Bat-related games. Sunsoft's Game Boy version of their second Bat game, Return of the Joker, didn't come out until around the second quarter of 1992, fairly close to the upcoming movie, even if it is obviously different. You would probably expect though that if there had been a Game Boy game, it'd have been made by Konami, same as the other Nintendo titles. However, they instead worked on a Game Boy only game based on Batman the Animated Series, which, let's not forget, made its TV debut a couple of months after the release of Returns in cinemas. This game came out in late 1993, and so while I suppose there would have been a short window in which a Returns game could have come out for the GB, perhaps the bosses at Konami were worried that, between that, the earlier Sunsoft game, and this upcoming title, the result might have been a significant case of overbaturation. Kill me sometimes with this banter, I really do. So that there's something else here aside from a hideous pun, I suppose it's worth having a quick look at the animated series game. It's the closest thing to something that represents the Game Boy here. I'm not fully sure when else I would get a chance to look at it, and I only have the 2 computer games left. So it's worth a look. After all, maybe there's a possibility that it was originally a Returns game that got switched to TAS in the middle of development. It's a platformer. Shocking, I know, split into 5 episodes, each starring someone else from the Rogues Gallery. Joker wants to send explosive bears to everyone in Gotham, Poison Ivy kidnaps Harvey Dent, pre-Two-Face, and wants to recreate Day of the Triffids on a citywide scale, Mr. Freeze and Scarecrow get together to put the willies up everybody, and so on. All very nice and super villainous, and told with the help of cutscenes. The platformer itself is decent. Bat's mainly punches and has a few batarans, and while he can only throw his hooks straight up, he can also wall jump, just like in the Sunsoft NES game. We've got some nice bits of sprite work here and there, although there's not too much in the way of music, which is a bit of a shame for a Konami title. There are also parts where you get to play as Robin. Robin is fairly similar to Batman. He has a bit less health, but he can use his acrobatics to hang onto ceilings and travel that way. This is the only title to come out under the animated series name. Other titles on the 16-bits came out after the name of the show had been changed to The Adventures of Batman and Robin. I wouldn't say this is on the level of those games, which are quite excellent after all, but it's a fine handheld platformer, and a decent enough challenge. Certainly worth a little look. Okay, 2 titles left, and things are about to get even more diverse. Our last 2 games came out on the computers, one for PC and one for Amiga. Are you ready for a Batman point-and-click adventure? And are you ready for a tale of absolute scumbag behaviour where fans of one computer thought they were getting a certain game and ended up with something completely different and far, far worse? Believe it or not, we've yet to see the worst game to come out under the Batman Returns name, but it's definitely coming. First off, however, we do have a bit of an adventure to look at. The PC Batman Returns game, originally released in December 1992, is a thoroughly different beast from all the others, being a point-and-click by Park Place under their Spirit of Discovery imprint, and distributed by Konami. The actual developers, though, were Subway Software, a studio belonging to the late William Bill Kunkel. Kunkel is a bit of an unsung hero, a lover and writer of comic books, a pro wrestling fan and journalist, and one of the first ever working video game journalists, starting out with a column called Arcade Alley in the late 70s, and moving towards a whole magazine, Electronic Games, from 1981, founded with friends and regular collaborators Arnie Katz and Joyce Worley. This same trio would start Subway Software in 1985, working on a selection of intriguing titles, including Micro League Wrestling, one of the first ever wrestling games, and Batman Returns is their final game. A huge Batman fan, details of how Kunkel snagged the job were available on his old column for Digital Press. When he heard that Konami was shopping for developers for Batman Returns based games and that Park Place had landed a contract with them, he used his connections at Park Place to get an opportunity to pitch an idea and landed a deal thanks to his adventure game experience. However, this didn't necessarily become the dream project Kunkel hoped for, as we'll soon go into. The game itself, I would say it's pretty okay, although this comes with a caveat that point-and-clicks really aren't my strong suit. It's different from the norm you may expect from LucasArts or Sierra games. There's actually no inventory puzzles at all. Now, this makes sense, really. Why on earth would a multimillionaire who can build gadgets to deal with absolutely anything need to tie a rake and hoe together with a shirt? The main focus of the game, especially for the first few days, is in compiling evidence, moving around the various locations, taking said evidence back to the Bat computer to view and extrapolate info from them, often having to be aware of the time and place that certain events are happening. Derailing Oswald Cobblepot's plan to become mayor is naturally the main focus, and if you've ever seen the flick, you'll know that in order to do so, you need to reveal his true nature to the public and find his plans to incriminate the mayor. The path to doing so leads through various other tasks: finding his HQ, combing through old Gotham Zoo, repeated visits to a fish market, and the odd bit of fighting with the man himself and his Red Triangle goons. These fights are cinematic in nature, mainly just happening until you use the right tool in your utility belt to take care of the enemy, with the chance to interrogate some of them after using your Bolo Batarang. Doing this is pretty important. Considering some of the attempts at action I've seen in point-and-click games, making these fights puzzles of a sort is a decent solution. The game is lovely looking, nice animation, nice recreations of the movie's settings, and a fine recreation of the classic Danny Elfman's score. However, there are certainly some issues. The whole process of moving from location to location to make sure you don't miss any bits of evidence can be a little repetitive, especially as there aren't all that many of them. One of the game's biggest flaws though is how it translates the movie to the screen. I think that'd be a bit of a disappointment for some. A lot of events and even characters from the movie basically just get crammed into the final day. Even Catwoman, who I think most would agree is a pretty bloody important part of the film, doesn't appear until you are virtually at the finish. The last bit of the game does become a bit of a mess, kind of shoehorning all of these things that happen in the movie right at the end, from the Ice Princess getting kidnapped, to duck vehicles and Selena Kyle to mistletoting Emperor Penguins, while most of the rest of the game is a fairly engrossing slow burner that, for a change, focuses on the detective side of Batman as opposed to the punchy face side that features in 90% of other Bat games. There's various other nice extras to add colour, getting those Gotham news reports, the option to eject from the Batmobile, which is fun to do at least once, even if it's an instant game over, and a database full of Gotham's various important people. That includes this funny little Easter egg, something that's purely for the wrestling fans. One of Gotham's known criminals is apparently Wade Barbecue Keller, who you may know as the writer of the Pro Wrestling Torch newsletter. Apparently he used to work for crooked landlords and will now hire himself out to anyone with enough money, and he likes to watch every one of his fires. I don't know, I get the impression from this that Kunkel didn't like Wade Keller all that much, for reasons that I don't know. Going back to the disconnect between this game and the movie, there is a bit of reasoning for this awkwardness. Bill Kunkel did not like the script for Batman Returns at all, saying that he openly wept after he finished reading the draft he'd been given. He wanted the game to be more of a celebration of Batman that would really get into that detective side of his character, perhaps more in line with the old comics, but sticking in events from the movie kinda got in the way, and the development became something of a running battle between Kunkel and Warner Brothers, who were mandating the inclusion of all these various things from the movie, and the whole experience was enough for Kunkel to stop making video games entirely. That's a shame, and while I suppose you can't blame Warner for wanting the movie to be a part of this game of the movie, it's definitely a two sides to every story type thing, and the Discord perhaps explains why so many of the movie's plot points only really happen in the last part, while others kinda, well, they just don't. Batman never gets framed for the Ice Princess's murder, in fact she doesn't even get murdered as far as I know, and really there's very little if any interaction with anyone like Max Schreck, or Mayor Jenkins, or anyone at all. Even Alfred barely appears. It's a pretty lonely life for Bruce Wayne, I'm afraid, even more so than usual. In fact, if this was the only experience you ever had of Batman, you would think that the Dark Knight's only friend in the world was a cigar-chomping fishmonger named Tony. As odd as this game might be, as an adventure and Bat title, I do think it is a curious one that's worth playing. It's not a famous point-and-click, nor do I believe that it's a well-liked one amongst the connoisseurs, but it does make for a change of pace from most other Batman games. finally, oh boy, it's time for the Amiga game. I have not been looking forward to this one at all, as it's something of a grim old story about the troubles of microcomputer development, particularly when it comes to studios with great names that were really starting to struggle during the 16-bit era. There's also a part where one magazine previewed an entirely different game to the one that Amiga folks ended up getting. So yeah, this is going to be the worst of the Batman Returns games. It's another side-scroller, but a really bloody shoddy one. However, as always, there is a little bit more to this game's story that's worth talking about. This version of Batman Returns was made by the Liverpool-based studio Denton Designs, or Dentons as they were known by this stage. It was contracted by Konami, but published through GameTech, the North American computer studio that Konami had close relations with. Initially, the game was going to be published not just for the Amiga, but for the Atari ST and even the Commodore 64. The C64 version was initially previewed in the August 1993 issue of Commodore Force. Now I think we can all agree that is really bloody late for a C64 game. As is often the case, Games That Weren't has a lot of documentation for this unfinished title. The magazine, formerly known as Zap64, leaped on to documenting the process, publishing a monthly diary for the game written by Roy Bannon, the project's lead. The game's creation wasn't going badly, and the two main diary entries detailed the process of largely completing the first two levels while getting assets ready for the other three. However, the third diary entry, from October's issue, largely binned any talk of the game's development, and instead detailed Roy's recent trip to nearby New Brighton. In other words, something's gone very wrong. Sure enough, Konami had decided that in the end, releasing a Batman Returns game on the C64 in late 1993 wasn't really worth the bother, and they cancelled it. Those at Denton's who worked on the title, from Roy Bannon to Paul Salmon and studio head and lead artist Ali Noble, were disappointed but perhaps not too surprised at Konami's decision. The Atari ST version of the game, which was previewed in the June 1993 issue of ST Action, was probably also cancelled around this time. By this stage in 1993, unfortunately, there wasn't much of a games market left on that system either. Currently, nothing exists of these games beyond screenshots. It's known that demos of the games were sent to Konami, but none of the people involved in the creation of these versions have been able to find them. In the end, the Amiga version is the only one to come out. Judging by the info available on the two unreleased versions, they were both a lot further along than the Amiga one was at the time of cancellation, but Konami judged that the Amiga release was the only one that could conceivably make any money. And so Denton's, disappointed already by the loss of two versions that could have potentially injected some much needed revenue, had to go into full crunch mode to try and get something out by the end of 1993. The Amiga game was also previewed a fair bit in various mags, looking similar to the other versions we've seen, although Amiga Action hardly helped matters when, in October 93, they ran a 2-page preview for a version of the PC point-and-click game. Someone clearly hugely screwed up, whether it was at GameTech or at the magazine or wherever. As far as anyone knows, there was never any plans or any work ever done on converting Subway's point-and-click to the Amiga. Therefore, if you were a regular reader of Amiga Action back in the day, and I am dearly sorry if that was the case, you may well have been even more disappointed by the game that finally came out for the Amiga very late on in 1993, perhaps even early 1994. Either way, it is easily the last of the Batman Returns games to be released, coming out months after any of the others. This game largely plays like a side-scrolling beat-em-up, where you have to deal with the various goons, usually red triangle folk but occasionally cops and penguins, before moving on to the next section. The general horror of this game lies in how stiff and useless the Dark Knight is. One look at his kicking is enough to make your heart sink, and every enemy seems to take a whole load of hits. And that's if you can hit them, because the collision detection is seriously balked in some parts to the point of comedy. This is largely the formula for the first two levels, and then the third, where you spend most of your time battling against Catwoman on Gotham's rooftops, introduces a lot more platforming. And that's where things get even worse. This isn't even just about using up to jump. The jump itself is so delayed, unpredictable and uncontrollable that it's comically difficult to do anything with it. Even the simplest of leaps became a frustrating nightmare. And yeah, if I'm honest, I really couldn't go much further. I had infinite lives on because frankly you'll need them to get anywhere at all with this, but it's one of the poorest attempts at a side-scroller that I've covered in a long time. The scant amount of good things I can say is that some of the music isn't too bad, and the game moves fast, but for an Amiga title from the end of '93, that's not much to say, and it certainly doesn't make up for the completely broken gameplay. The graphics also, yeah, definitely the weakest of any Batman game we've seen. The contemporary reviews for the game were similarly scathing. The highest it could muster was a 55% from German mag Amiga Joker. CU Amiga said that it would be easier for them to pull a double-decker bus out of their bottoms than recommend the game. Simon Byron of The One said that Batman looked more like Gitman and compared it unfavourably to Fatman the Caped Consumer of all games, while Stuart Campbell of Amiga Power said that your kid sister's My Little Pony could write a better Batman game with a badly bugged version of the shoot-'em-up construction kit. A common theme in these reviews is disappointment at the name of Denton being associated with it. A great studio in the 8-bit days, responsible for the likes of Frankie Goes to Hollywood, The Great Escape, Where Time Stood Still, and many others. But alas, time wasn't always kind to the great names from the 80s. Dentons were not in a good spot by this stage, and sadly Batman Returns would be one of their last games. GameTech, the publishers, pretty much sent it out to die. It was released as a budget title, and presumably not in any great quantity, so it's highly doubtful it made much in the way of money. In the end, it would have probably been better if this Amiga version had met the same fate as the Atari and C64 ones. A truly woeful and saddening affair. And with that, we're done with all of the Batman Returns games. And what an interesting journey it's been. There are surely a few movies out there that have more tie-in games associated with it, Star Wars for an obvious example, but we have quite a diverse range of titles here, including some well-known excellent ones and others that deserve way more recognition. Even the lesser titles at least have interesting stories related to them, and it's been a lot of fun to play and research all of these different takes on this particular Bat sequel. Hopefully you've also enjoyed watching it, but for now, well, join me next time. Same Kim time, same Kim channel, and all of that. Bye for now.